Welcome to a story that sounds impossible, but is rooted in the brutal realities of plantation life. Tonight, we uncover what happened when a young enslaved boy was bitten by a deadly snake and abandoned in the fields, left to die under the burning sun. But what happened 10 hours later shocked everyone who witnessed it. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these true stories travel. And please subscribe, because a lot of deep research and careful fact-finding goes into uncovering these historical accounts and bringing forgotten voices back into the light. Long before the snake ever struck, the plantation itself was a world built on exhaustion, fear, and control. Days began before sunrise, when the sky was still gray and heavy with mist, and ended long after darkness swallowed the fields. Enslaved men, women, and even children were driven into labor with little rest and less mercy. The rhythm of life was dictated not by seasons or human need, but by profit. Cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, whatever the crop, it demanded relentless hands, and those hands belonged to people who had no choice. For children, survival meant growing up far too quickly. An enslaved boy might begin with small tasks, carrying water, gathering tools, scaring birds from crops, but before long he was expected to work nearly as hard as any adult. Hunger was common. Shoes were a luxury. The sun burned skin raw in summer, and winter winds cut through thin clothing without resistance. Illness or injury rarely brought comfort. It often brought punishment for slowing production. Childhood, as the world understands it, barely existed in such a place. The physical conditions were brutal. Fields stretched endlessly under a punishing sun, offering no shade except at the distant tree line. Overseers on horseback watched constantly, measuring output with sharp eyes and harsher discipline. The crack of a whip or the threat of it hung permanently in the air. Every movement was monitored. Every pause risked consequence. The land itself seemed to absorb the suffering, silent witness to generations forced to bend over its soil. Beyond the labor, there was the psychological weight. Families could be separated without warning, sold, traded, or relocated at an owner's whim. That constant uncertainty created a quiet terror that lived beneath the surface of daily life. Parents taught their children how to survive not just the work, but the unpredictability. Speak carefully, move quickly, do not draw attention, hope quietly, fear loudly, but only inside your own thoughts. Medical care, when it existed at all, was rarely given with urgency or compassion. Enslaved people were often seen as replaceable labor rather than human beings deserving of treatment. Minor injuries were ignored. Major ones were assessed in terms of lost productivity. If someone collapsed in the field, the first concern was often the work left unfinished. Compassion was inconsistent, and survival frequently depended on resilience rather than assistance. Nature itself added another layer of danger. Plantations in the American South were home to venomous snakes, disease, carrying insects, and harsh environmental conditions. Fields bordered swamps and thick grasses where copperheads, rattlesnakes, and cottonmouths thrived. Workers moved through these hazards daily, often barefoot or poorly shod, increasing the risk of bites and infections. The land that produced wealth for owners also concealed constant threats for those forced to harvest it. In such a world, life balanced on a thin edge. Strength was necessary, endurance essential, and hope a fragile but stubborn thing. The harsh realities of plantation life shaped every breath, every step, every sunrise. And it was within this unforgiving environment, where danger came not only from human cruelty but from the earth itself, that the boys' story would unfold. From the moment they were strong enough to walk steadily, enslaved children were drawn into the machinery of plantation labor. What began as small errands quickly evolved into structured responsibility. A boy might start by carrying drinking water to adults in the fields or gathering scattered tools after sundown. But within a few short years, he would be expected to keep pace with grown men under the same relentless sun. There was no protected space called childhood, only preparation for harder work ahead. The day typically began before dawn. Children were shaken awake in cramped quarters, often sharing rough bedding with siblings or relatives. Breakfast, if there was any, was minimal: cornmeal, scraps or leftovers from the previous night. Then came the walk to the fields, sometimes miles away, feet bare against uneven ground. By sunrise they were already working, moving in straight rows with mechanical repetition, learning quickly that slowing down meant punishment. Tasks varied by age and strength. Younger children scared birds from crops, cleared weeds, picked stones from soil, or carried harvested bundles too heavy for their small frames. As they grew older, they were handed sharper tools and heavier loads. Boys were often assigned physically demanding labor earlier than girls, though both faced exhausting expectations. The plantation system measured worth in output, not years lived. Education in the traditional sense was denied. Literacy was often forbidden, and curiosity discouraged unless it served labor. Instead, children learned survival skills: how to read an overseer's mood, how to hide exhaustion, how to swallow fear. Parents and elders quietly passed down cultural memory, faith, songs, and coded wisdom in whispers at night. These moments became their classroom, preserving identity in a system designed to erase it. Play, when it happened, was brief and cautious. A carved stick might become a toy. A patch of dirt might serve as a game board scratched with quick lines before being wiped away. Laughter was possible, but it existed in stolen fragments between responsibilities. Even joy had to be careful, because being seen as distracted or idle could bring harsh consequences. Physical development was shaped by labor. Muscles hardened early. Hands calloused before adolescence. Injuries healed improperly due to lack of treatment, leaving lasting damage. Growth spurts did not excuse performance. In fact, increasing size often meant increased workload. A boy who reached a certain height was no longer treated as a child at all, but as another full unit of labor in the field. Despite everything, resilience took root. Children formed bonds with one another, creating quiet networks of support. They shared food, warned each other of approaching overseers, and offered comfort after punishment. In an environment built on control, these connections became acts of resistance. Child labor on plantations was not only a physical burden, it was a calculated system meant to shape obedience early. Yet even within that system, young hearts found ways to endure, adapt, and survive. In the 19th century American South, the rural landscape was as dangerous as it was fertile. Plantations were often surrounded by thick brush, marshlands, riverbanks, and tall grasses, ideal habitats for venomous snakes. Workers moved through these areas daily, clearing land, planting crops, repairing fences, and tending irrigation ditches. Every step into the field carried a silent risk, especially during the warmer months, when snakes were most active. Among the most feared species was the rattlesnake, easily recognized by the warning sound of its tail, but not always seen in time. Its venom could cause severe tissue damage, internal bleeding, and intense pain. In regions near swamps and slow-moving water, cottonmouths, also known as water moccasins, were common. Aggressive when threatened, they blended into muddy banks and shallow waters, making accidental encounters frequent. Copperheads, with their patterned camouflage, hid almost invisibly among fallen leaves and dry grass, striking quickly when stepped on. Medical understanding of snake venom during that era was limited. While some local remedies existed, such as herbal poultices, whiskey applications, cutting the wound, or attempting to suck out venom, there was no standardized antivenom treatment available until the late 19th century, and even then it was rare in remote areas. Survival often depended on the amount of venom injected, the location of the bite, and the physical condition of the victim. Enslaved workers faced even greater danger because protective clothing was minimal or non-existent. Many labored barefoot or in thin, worn shoes that offered little defense against fangs. Thick trousers and gloves were luxuries rarely provided. Clearing dense vegetation exposed ankles and legs directly to hidden threats. A single careless step in tall grass could result in a strike. Seasonal patterns increased the risk. During summer heat, snakes became more active, seeking shade under crops or cool spaces near irrigation channels. Harvest time, when workers moved rapidly and focused on speed, created conditions ripe for accidents. Fatigue also played a role. Long hours dulled alertness, making it harder to notice subtle movement in the grass. Beyond physical harm, snake bites carried psychological fear. Stories circulated of individuals collapsing within hours, their limbs swelling grotesquely, their bodies overtaken by fever. In isolated plantations where medical help was distant or denied, a bite could feel like a death sentence. Superstition sometimes filled the gaps left by science, with people attributing survival or death to fate, divine will, or curses. In such an environment, venomous snakes were not rare anomalies, but part of daily life. The land that sustained the plantation economy also harbored these silent predators. Every rustle in the grass, every ripple near the water's edge, carried uncertainty. For those forced to labor in those fields, the threat was constant, unseen, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. The moment the snake struck, everything happened in seconds. One sharp cry cut through the steady rhythm of field work, breaking the usual silence of forced concentration. Tools paused mid-air, heads turned. The boy stumbled backward, clutching his leg, eyes wide with shock. For a brief instant, no one fully understood what had happened, only that something sudden and dangerous had pierced the routine of the day. Then someone spotted the movement in the grass. A quick coil, a flash of scales, and the snake disappeared as swiftly as it had emerged. The realization spread fast. Snake bite. The word carried weight. Workers nearby stepped back instinctively, scanning the ground with fearful eyes. The overseer rode closer, demanding to know what caused the disruption. The boy's breathing quickened, panic rising as pain began to spread from the puncture wounds. At first, there was confusion about what to do. Some older field hands knew fragments of traditional remedies: tie a cloth above the wound, keep the victim still, try to slow the venom. A strip of fabric was quickly torn and wrapped tightly around his leg. Someone suggested cutting the wound to let the poison bleed out, but hesitation stopped them. The overseer's impatience hung heavy in the air. Time spent tending to the injured meant time lost in the fields. The boy began to tremble. Whether from fear or the venom itself, his body reacted visibly. Swelling formed around the bite, and sweat gathered on his forehead. A few workers exchanged worried glances. They had seen bites before. Sometimes the victim survived. Sometimes they did not. The uncertainty made the moment tense, almost suspended between action and indifference. Instead of calling for a doctor or transporting him, immediately there was calculation. How serious did it look? Would he recover on his own? Was it worth halting work? The harsh logic of plantation life intruded quickly. Productivity weighed against compassion. The overseer, focused on maintaining order, urged the others back to their tasks. The boy was pulled to the side, laid beneath a tree at the edge of the field, out of direct sunlight, but still far from true shelter. As minutes passed, the initial urgency faded into uneasy silence. The workers returned to their rows, though their attention wavered. Every so often, someone glanced toward the tree. The boy's groans grew softer. His movements slowed. From a distance, it was impossible to tell whether the venom was spreading rapidly or if exhaustion was overtaking him. The immediate reaction revealed more than fear of a snake. It exposed the priorities of the system surrounding him. Concern flickered, but it was restrained by authority and expectation. In those first crucial moments, decisions were made not solely by medical need, but by hierarchy and control. And as the day continued under the blazing sun, the boy lay waiting, caught between life and whatever the venom intended to bring. When serious injury struck on a plantation, medical care was never guaranteed, especially for enslaved individuals. Enslaved people were legally considered property, and treatment decisions were often based on economic value rather than human urgency. If an injury threatened long-term productivity, an owner might intervene, but if survival seemed uncertain or the cost inconvenient, delay was common. Compassion was filtered through calculation. Doctors were not always nearby. Rural plantations could be miles from the nearest trained physician, and travel itself required time, money, and willingness. In emergencies like snake bites, those first critical hours mattered most. Yet enslaved victims were frequently left waiting while someone decided whether summoning help was necessary. The delay alone could mean the difference between life and death. Instead of professional treatment, makeshift remedies were often attempted. Overseers or fellow workers relied on folk knowledge, tight tourniquets, herbal poultices, burning the wound, or attempting to draw out venom. Some of these methods were rooted in traditional African healing practices, passed quietly through generations. Others were based on European frontier medicine. But without proper tools or understanding of venom's effects, results were unpredictable. Access to rest and recovery was also limited. Even after injury, enslaved individuals were often expected to return to labor quickly. A person too weak to stand might be labeled uncooperative rather than critically ill. Fevers, infections, and untreated wounds could worsen because sustained recovery time was rarely granted. The body was pushed to function long before it had healed. There was also the cruel reality of replaceability. Plantation systems were structured around labor supply. If one worker died, another could be purchased. This brutal mindset sometimes reduced urgency when injuries occurred. An enslaved child, especially, might not be seen as worth extensive effort unless already considered valuable for future productivity. That dehumanization shaped decisions in subtle but devastating ways. For the enslaved community itself, the lack of formal care created a culture of mutual support. Elders shared remedies. Mothers and fathers tended to wounds at night in cramped quarters, using whatever resources they could gather. Healing became communal and quiet, carried out in secret acts of protection. In many cases, survival depended more on these hidden networks than on official intervention. In moments of crisis, the absence of proper medical care exposed the deeper injustice of the system. An injury that would have prompted immediate attention for an owner's family might be dismissed or delayed for those in bondage. Life hung in the balance, not only because of the venom or wound itself, but because of whether anyone in authority chose to act. And too often, that choice came too late, or not at all. The decision to abandon the injured boy was not made with dramatic announcement. It unfolded quietly, almost casually, shaped by the harsh logic of plantation routine. After the initial panic faded and the swelling in his leg became visible, the overseer assessed him from a distance. The question was not spoken plainly, but it lingered in the air. Was he likely to survive, or was he already lost? That silent calculation determined everything that followed. A few workers hesitated, lingering near him longer than they were supposed to. One suggested carrying him back to the quarters. Another muttered that the venom looked serious. But hesitation was dangerous. The overseer's presence enforced obedience, and work could not stop for long. Orders were given to move him out of the direct rows of crops so he would not disrupt productivity. Two men lifted him under the arms and dragged him toward the edge of the field. They placed him beneath a lone tree where thin shade barely softened the heat. It was not true shelter, just a compromise between visibility and removal. From there, he could be watched without interfering with labor. The message was clear. He would remain there unless his condition changed significantly. No one was instructed to stay beside him. No one was assigned to monitor his breathing or fever closely. The justification was rooted in harsh practicality. Some believed if the bite were truly fatal, nothing could be done anyway. Others feared that moving him too much might worsen the spread of venom. But beneath those surface explanations lay a more troubling truth. Halting work for extended care was not a priority. The crops demanded attention. Time meant money. The boy's life was weighed against the day's output. As hours passed, the workers returned to their rows, though their focus fractured. Glances drifted toward the tree again and again. From a distance, he appeared small and still. Occasionally, a faint movement suggested he was alive, but no one approached unless commanded. The overseer rode past once or twice, observing without dismounting. His stillness was interpreted as confirmation that the outcome was inevitable. Within the quarters later, whispers would question the decision. Some would wonder whether more could have been done. But in the moment, fear of punishment silenced action. Enslaved individuals were rarely empowered to override authority, even when a life hung in the balance. Obedience was enforced not only through rules, but through survival instinct. The act of leaving him there became symbolic of the system itself: efficiency over empathy, control over compassion. Beneath that thin patch of shade, the boy lay suspended between life and death, not only because of venom in his veins, but because the world around him had decided to wait rather than intervene. And as the sun continued its slow arc across the sky, abandonment became as heavy as the heat pressing down upon him. As the first hour passed, the venom began asserting itself in ways both visible and hidden. The puncture wounds darkened, swelling outward as inflammation spread through the surrounding tissue. Pain radiated up his leg in sharp, pulsing waves. Snake venom, depending on the species, can attack the body in different ways. Some destroy tissue and blood cells, others disrupt the nervous system, and some do both. Without treatment, the body is forced to fight an internal battle it may or may not win. By the second and third hours, systemic symptoms often begin to appear. Dizziness, nausea, and weakness can overtake a victim as toxins enter the bloodstream. The boy's breathing may have become shallow, his heart racing in response to shock and stress. Excessive sweating, trembling, and confusion are common reactions. In severe envenomation, blood clotting can become impaired, leading to internal bleeding or dangerous drops in blood pressure. Swelling typically intensifies over time, sometimes doubling the size of the affected limb. The skin may grow tight and discolored, shifting from red to deep purple. In hemotoxic bites, tissue damage can progress rapidly, potentially leading to necrosis if untreated. The pain alone can be overwhelming, especially under the heat of the sun, which further strains the body's resources and accelerates dehydration. Between the 4th and 6th hours, outcomes can diverge. In some cases, venom continues spreading, pushing the victim toward collapse. In others, particularly if the snake delivered a dry bite with little or no venom, the symptoms may stabilize. The human body's response varies widely based on age, health, bite location, and venom quantity. A bite to a lower limb may progress more slowly than one closer to the torso, buying precious time. Shock remains a serious risk throughout this period. When blood pressure drops too low, organs may not receive adequate oxygen. The victim might appear pale, weak, and barely conscious. Fever can set in as the immune system reacts aggressively to foreign toxins. Without fluids or medical support, dehydration compounds every symptom, thickening the blood and making circulation even more difficult. Yet the body is not passive. The immune system works continuously, attempting to neutralize and isolate the venom's components. Clotting mechanisms try to repair damaged vessels. In some individuals, partial resistance or lower venom exposure allows the body to regain balance after several critical hours. If the venom dose was small or the strike incomplete, recovery becomes possible, though far from guaranteed. By the 7th to 10th hour, the most dangerous window either begins to close or reaches its peak. If the victim is still breathing, conscious, and not in irreversible shock, survival chances increase significantly. The swelling may plateau, the fever may break, exhaustion replaces agony. In rare cases, what seemed fatal hours earlier begins to stabilize unexpectedly. And it is in that fragile turning point, when death appears certain, but the body refuses to surrender, that survival can look almost impossible to those watching from the outside. Tension on the plantation didn't fade as the boy lay under the tree. It grew, subtle but persistent. Workers returned to their tasks, but their eyes often flicked back to him, measuring his shallow breaths, the faint twitch of a hand, the occasional flicker of eyelids. Every movement, or lack thereof, became a source of speculation. Whispers began to circulate among the field hands, low murmurs that carried both fear and curiosity. Some wondered if he might truly die. Others half hoped he would somehow survive. The overseer's presence amplified the unease. Though he rode past without dismounting, his gaze was sharp, judging not only the boy's condition, but the reactions of those around him. Workers knew that showing too much concern could be seen as insubordination or weakness. They returned to their rows, but a heavy silence settled in their hearts, a mix of dread and fascination. The tension was both social and psychological, a shared anxiety that no one dared voice fully. Superstition also fed the unease. Stories of miraculous survival and curses circulated quietly among the enslaved community. Some whispered that spirits were watching, that the boy had been marked for death or protection. In a world where science offered limited explanations, folklore and fear intertwined, shaping perceptions. Every small twitch or cough became evidence for one theory or another. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors and fellow workers debated in hushed tones about what should be done. Should someone carry him to the quarters? Was he beyond help? Each decision, or indecision, was layered with fear of punishment. Yet the psychological weight was heavier than the physical. Witnessing the slow progression of venom or the boy's struggle evoked guilt, dread, and helplessness. The mind began to race with possibilities, some rational, some darkly imaginative. Even those not immediately responsible felt the tension. The labor itself became erratic, hands faltered, crops were handled more cautiously, and communication became terse. The boy's suffering cast a long shadow over the field, demonstrating how a single incident could ripple outward, affecting the mental state of an entire workforce. Observation became a quiet obsession. People could not look away, even as they feared what they might see. Fear mingled with expectation. Some workers assumed the worst, predicting that the day's end would bring news of his death. Others held on to a fragile hope, though they could not admit it aloud. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant animal calls, set nerves on edge. The natural environment itself seemed to echo the tension, amplifying every heartbeat and every whispered worry. By mid-afternoon, the psychological atmosphere reached a peak. Sweat mixed with fear, the sun bore down unrelentingly, and the boy's faint signs of life were scrutinized constantly. Everyone waiting for an outcome, whether death or survival, experienced the strain of not knowing. That tension, born of immediate danger and compounded by systemic neglect and superstition, defined the hours. The psychological pressure on the plantation was as tangible and suffocating as the heat itself, setting the stage for the shock that, would come 10 hours later. As the hours stretched on, the 10-hour mark became a looming threshold that no one could ignore. Each minute that passed without immediate collapse or death brought a mix of confusion and heightened curiosity. The boy's breathing, once shallow and irregular, began to show faint signs of steadiness. Though weak and trembling, his body had not succumbed to the venom as everyone had anticipated. Workers began to notice subtle movements, a finger twitch, a hand shift, that suggested life still lingered. The psychological shift among those observing him was palpable. What had once seemed inevitable, the boy's death, was now uncertain. Some stared in disbelief, unwilling to believe their own eyes. Others whispered that perhaps he had been spared, or that the venom had missed its mark. 10 hours of survival under the harsh sun, without medical aid, without proper care, seemed impossible in their minds. Rumors began to spread quietly through the plantation, and the story of the boy's endurance started taking on almost legendary weight. At the same time, the boy's own body was reaching a turning point. Adrenaline, coupled with a natural immune response, may have slowed the spread of venom and stabilized vital signs. Pain persisted, but faint strength returned to his limbs. His awareness sharpened slightly, and he began to respond, even if minimally, to the surrounding environment. Every subtle shift in position or blink of the eye was amplified in significance by the workers who had assumed he would not survive. This moment highlighted the cruel unpredictability of life under bondage. Those who had left him to die were now forced to confront the possibility that their assumptions were wrong. The psychological tension shifted from fear of death to astonishment at survival. In a place where control was paramount, and where every action was measured against labor output, the boy's endurance disrupted the established order. He had survived when he was expected to fail, creating an invisible challenge to authority. Meanwhile, his faint movements inspired silent awe among fellow enslaved workers. Though they could not intervene freely, they began to imagine the implications of his survival. Could he truly recover? Would he be punished despite surviving? Survival became a quiet form of resistance, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, the body, and perhaps the spirit, could defy expectations. Observers were caught between disbelief and cautious hope. The 10-hour survival window also demonstrated the body's remarkable resilience. Many people in similar situations might have succumbed long before, particularly children with smaller bodies and less physical reserve. The fact that he was alive, though weak, challenged conventional assumptions about venom, human endurance, and the limits of neglect. Survival was no longer a simple medical anomaly. It became a testament to strength and chance interwoven. As evening approached, the implications of those 10 hours began to settle in. The boy had endured a period that should have ended in death, and this endurance shifted the emotional and social atmosphere on the plantation. What had begun as an ordinary day of labor had become a moment of collective astonishment. 10 hours had passed, and the impossible had begun to reveal itself. The watchers were left to reckon with the reality that the boy, abandoned, bitten, and left to die, was still alive, and nothing would ever feel certain in the fields again. As the boy's body slowly stabilized, observers and workers alike struggled to make sense of what they were witnessing. From a purely scientific perspective, several factors could explain the seeming miracle of his survival. One possibility was a dry bite. When a venomous snake strikes but injects little to no venom, in such cases, the damage can be limited to pain, swelling, and minor tissue trauma, giving the victim a critical window to recover naturally. While rare, these occurrences were well documented in rural areas where snake encounters were common. Another explanation lay in the boy's physiology. Human bodies vary in their response to toxins, and some individuals possess natural resistance or immunity to certain venom components. Youth, physical resilience, and perhaps even prior exposure to smaller bites could have allowed his system to neutralize the poison more effectively than expected. His smaller body size might have seemed like a disadvantage. Yet in some cases, rapid metabolic response in children can improve recovery chances. The location of the bite also played a role. The snake had struck the lower leg, which is farther from vital organs and major blood vessels than other areas. This meant the venom spread more slowly through the bloodstream, giving the boy's body precious hours to counteract the effects. Circulation, lymphatic flow, and the boy's movements all influenced how quickly the toxins moved, potentially limiting the severity of systemic symptoms. Environmental factors contributed as well. The shaded tree, though minimal, provided relief from the blazing sun, reducing the stress of overheating and dehydration. Humidity, temperature, and airflow can subtly affect the progression of venom symptoms, and even small advantages in environment can increase the chances of survival. In this case, nature itself may have lent a small but vital hand. The psychological dimension cannot be overlooked. Survival instincts often manifest physically. The boy's will to live, even in unconscious or semi-conscious states, likely encouraged involuntary movements, regulated breathing, and the slow stabilization of heart rate. In extreme situations, the mind and body can work together to preserve life, even when external help is absent. This blend of physiological and psychological resilience was critical in those 10 hours. Compounding these factors, the type of snake and the quantity of venom delivered mattered immensely. Not every bite from a venomous species guarantees fatality. Some strikes deliver minimal venom, while others may miss critical tissues entirely. The boy's survival might have been the result of a combination of chance and biology, an intersection where risk did not lead to the expected outcome. Ultimately, while folklore and superstition filled the gaps in understanding, the truth lay in a mix of natural resilience, environmental conditions, and a degree of luck. Survival, in such cases, challenges assumptions about life and death. Science can explain part of it, but the story of this boy's endurance also reflects something more profound: the unpredictability of the human body and the thin line between fatality and recovery in moments of extreme danger. On the plantation, superstition and fear were as much a part of daily life as labor and punishment. Stories of spirits, curses, and miraculous survival circulated quietly among enslaved communities, shaping the way people interpreted events they could not fully explain. When the boy was bitten and left to die, these beliefs immediately influenced perception. Every slight movement or sign of life was scrutinized for meaning beyond the physical, a possible sign of divine intervention or supernatural protection. Workers whispered that the boy might be marked by the ancestors or watched over by unseen forces. Some feared that if he survived, it could be a warning, a sign that misfortune awaited anyone who had shown cruelty or indifference. These beliefs carried weight because superstition served a practical purpose in an environment where formal medical care was minimal or absent. Understanding danger and survival in spiritual terms helped people cope with the constant unpredictability of plantation life. The overlap of superstition with reality often heightened psychological tension. The boy's faint movements, his groans, and the subtle rise and fall of his chest became loaded with symbolic significance. Those watching had to reconcile the tangible evidence of his life with the intangible narratives they carried from generations of oral tradition. Every twitch or blink was interpreted not only as a biological reaction, but as a message from beyond, blurring lines between natural survival and mystical explanation. Fear also amplified these interpretations. Plantation workers knew the cost of error in both action and judgment. If the overseer or the owners noticed too much attention given to superstition, punishment could follow. Yet ignoring the signs carried its own danger. In a world where survival often depended on reading subtle cues from both humans and nature, misinterpretation could be fatal. Thus, superstition became a lens through which to navigate life and death uncertainty. The stories of miraculous survival often intertwined with communal memory. Tales of individuals who defied death circulated quietly from one generation to the next, and this boy's endurance quickly became part of that oral tradition. What might be interpreted by outsiders as a scientific anomaly was understood by insiders as another thread in the tapestry of survival lore, a sign that even in extreme oppression, life could resist finality. These beliefs also shaped behavior in subtle ways. Workers were more cautious near the boy, partly out of fear and partly out of respect for the unknown forces at work. Conversations were hushed, actions deliberate. The environment became charged, a mix of observation, anxiety, and reverence. Superstition created both a protective buffer and a heightened sense of accountability in those who remained nearby. By the time night approached, superstition had transformed into a shared emotional experience. The boy's survival was no longer seen as merely physical, it was imbued with spiritual significance. What science could not explain was framed in the language of spirits, omens, and ancestral power. In the minds of those who had left him to die, survival became not just a medical or miraculous event, but a phenomenon that demanded respect, reflection, and awe, a story that would be remembered long after the fields fell silent. The boy's survival, against all odds, became an act of quiet defiance against the system that sought to control him. In the eyes of those who had abandoned him, life itself had challenged authority. The overseers and some field hands had assumed his death was inevitable, a result of both venom and neglect. Yet his endurance disrupted that expectation, demonstrating that even the harshest conditions could not fully suppress human resilience. By surviving, the boy reclaimed a measure of agency that the plantation sought to deny. Every breath he drew, every movement he made, was a subtle assertion that his body could resist oppression. In an environment designed to strip individuals of choice, the act of enduring a lethal bite without immediate care became more than mere survival. It was a statement that his existence could not be fully dictated by others. For the enslaved community, his survival resonated as a symbol of hope. It reminded them that, despite cruelty, exhaustion, and exposure to danger, the human spirit could endure. Stories like these were passed quietly from one worker to another, strengthening communal bonds and reinforcing the belief that life persisted even under extreme oppression. The boy's experience became part of the collective consciousness, a narrative of resilience that outlasted the immediate incident. The event also had a subtle impact on the psychological hierarchy of the plantation. Those who had counted him dead were forced to witness a reversal of expectation. Authority, which relied on certainty and obedience, encountered a moment of unpredictability. Even the most rigid overseers had to acknowledge that survival did not always follow the rules set by labor and control. The boy's body, in surviving, became a challenge to assumptions about mortality and obedience. At a personal level, the experience likely changed the boy profoundly. Surviving a near-death encounter without aid would have heightened his awareness of vulnerability and his own strength. Every sensation, the pain, the swelling, the struggle to breathe, left a lasting imprint, creating a deep understanding of both the cruelty of his environment and the limits of its power over him. This survival became a turning point, shaping his perception of self and the world around him. The story also illustrates a broader truth about oppression and endurance. Systems built on control and dehumanization often assume total compliance or fatality, but human resilience is unpredictable. Physical survival can intersect with psychological and even social resistance, turning what seems like a simple act of staying alive into a profound statement. In this case, 10 hours under the threat of death became more than a medical anomaly. It became an embodiment of defiance. Finally, the boy's endurance left an impression on everyone who witnessed it, creating a story that would outlast that single day in the field. Survival against such odds served as a reminder that even in extreme cruelty, human life is not easily extinguished. His recovery became a testament to endurance, resilience, and the quiet power of survival as a form of resistance, offering a legacy that extended far beyond the physical act itself.